Welcome to St. John. Nothing Happened Here, with your hosts Greg Marquis and Mark Allen Green, a show all about a little city on the east coast of Canada where nothing ever happened. Except for this.
Let's go back, September the 11th, 1968, to where we left off with Air Canada Flight 303 preparing to leave St. John for Toronto after arriving from Moncton, New Brunswick. The 48-seat plane is less than half full. Lots of elbow room for us on this flight. We hear the plane door close behind us, followed by the heavy latch securing us all inside. The passenger boarding stairs are rolled off, and we begin to back away from the terminal building. Before we know it, we're racing down the runway, and our wheels leave the ground. Through the panoramic Viscount windows, we see the world grow small below us. There's a mother with an infant child near the front of the plane. The child is calm and quiet for now, and the mother is doing everything she can to keep him that way. As well, close to the front of the plane is the gentleman who climbed aboard last. The tall man with the raincoat, and he's wearing sunglasses. Does he look nervous to you? We reach cruising altitude, and the seatbelt light goes off. Right away, the two flight attendants leap into action. One disappears behind the curtain at the back of the plane, ready to fill the drink orders being taken by the other attendant in the cabin. Should we order another round? I think we should. The tall man in the front rises from his seat, turns around with his raincoat draped over his arm. Probably just going to the washroom. But why wouldn't he leave the coat on his seat? However, instead of going to the washroom at the back of the plane, he disappears quickly behind the curtain to the galley, where we just saw the flight attendant enter. We hear odd sounds and words we can't quite make out. Let's go take a look. Make sure everything is all right with everyone. We slowly approach the curtain. The man's voice is getting harsher, more insistent. Let's move the curtain back so we can see what's going on behind it. Just a crack. I'm sure everything's fine. Somewhat sure. Hopeful. Now let's take a look. Our jaws drop. What we see has never been viewed before on a commercial airplane in Canada. The man's raincoat now lies on the floor. He holds a gun pressed to the neck of the flight attendant. We finally can make out what he's saying. There's going to be a few changes around here. This plane is not going to Toronto. We're going to Cuba. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. My name is Mark, and over there is Greg. I think he's sipping a in-flight cocktail right now. And that means it's St. John. Nothing happened here with the exception of the first hijacking in Canadian history. And this is part 2. So if you remember back to part 1, we talked about the golden age of flight. We talked about the golden age of skyjacking, and we talked about Charles Beasley, who was the person who skyjacked the first plane in Canadian history, and the bank robbery in Texas. So now we're getting back into it. And Greg, tell us about the surprise we have for everyone.
The surprise we have, Mark, is that we were able to track down and talk to 4 people who were on that flight 56 years ago, plus someone who was working in the air terminal that day.
Wow. Now, do you know if they've been interviewed since 1968 on this issue?
One person says she was interviewed around the time of 9/11, initially approached by the CBC, but they never ran the story. So as far as we know, we are the first investigators to talk to these people in many, many years.
So we're reopening the story after 58 years.
Yeah, 56 years. That's right.
56 years to do the math carried to. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. So 56 years. Okay. Well, let's get back into it. So where we left off last time, we had Charles Beasley coming into the St. John airport and going to the ticket counter to Bud Kavanaugh, who was the ticket agent at the time. Let's listen now to Charles Bud Kavanaugh's recollections. Mr. Kavanaugh worked for Air Canada and its predecessor, TransCanada Airlines, for 37 years, starting in 1957.
I remember that day. It wasn't a busy day. Normally, we would have lots of people lining up, but this particular day, there was just a few stragglers coming in, and I remember seeing this car with a foreign license on it, stop right at the front door. And of course, we're only a few feet from that front door entrance. So, and then this tall black man got out and strolled up to the counter. And I was looking up to see about this car because of the foreign plates on it. I could see them from the desk. And then he checked in and just in a normal manner. Never thought anything suspicious, and then he kind of left the counter, and because it was quite a while before the flight departed, but after that he seemed to disappear, whether he went to the restaurant or what, I don't know. And then finally the flight loaded, and this man, he went on with the crowd, and because we were at the gate, and we would see the people departing going on. There was no hesitation about going through security or anything like that in those days. And the flight departed, and short time later, the boys from the radio range, our Air Canada radio boys, come out and said that flight has been hijacked, which we couldn't believe. Anyway, we all kept, really our ears to the phone and what they could find out for us. And then we didn't know anything about the stewardess with the guy with a gun to her head. But we did find out that the flight diverted to Montreal, but not then. We didn't know what the story was.
Now, Charles Beasley, he had a ticket under the name Mr. Garvey. No first name, but just Mr. Garvey. Now, Greg, does Garvey have any potential significance to this story than using the alias of Garvey?
Yes. I mean, Marcus Garvey was a well-known Black nationalist from the first half of the 20th century. He was from Jamaica originally, and he was a role model for many African American and Canadian people as well. And he believed in Pan-Africanism, and he believed in Black separatism, not integration, a bit more radical. And he had a revival during the 1960s as young Black people explored Black power and Black identity and Black activism. He became kind of a symbol for many people involved in the Black freedom movement during that period.
And that seems to go along with Beasley's political leanings, because he was not of the earlier ilk of the civil rights movement. He was more into the Black power movement.
He was more, he was coming out of that, because SNCC did start as an integrationist organization, but by the mid-'60s, it had become more activist and more sort of in the streets. Not necessarily violent, but certainly more direct action.
Okay. And I would say that would lend credence to his position that he was doing it for activist purposes if he was using the alias of a Black activist, especially a Pan-Africanism.
Yeah, and of course,
Black activist.
Someone else may have also purchased a ticket and come up with the idea.
True enough. And we're speculating on Garvey, right? We don't know that it was Marcus Garvey. We're just putting together a reasonable narrative.
Yeah, I think it's pretty likely that it was. Yeah,
pretty likely. Okay, so we're in the St. John Airport. Flight 303, Air Canada, is coming in from Moncton. Mm-hmm. And it's picking up some passengers in St. John, but originated from Moncton. It only picked up 6 passengers, one being Charles Beasley in St. John. Mm-hmm. Now, do we have any information on what was it like in the airport? Did anyone spot Mr. Beasley? Did anyone find anything suspicious going on or think that something was up?
Yeah, I mean, Mike Wenberg, who was only 17 at the time, and his brother, when we have a clip of Mike, maybe.
We do have a clip from Mike. Let's hear it.
Waiting area, as it then was in 1968, was certainly not busy. There weren't many passengers around. But both my brother Rick and I noticed immediately. I didn't know it was Mr. Beasley, of course, at the time, but noticed a gentleman in a white trench coat who was just, we both felt nervous. It was odd, only because, not because he was black, but because he was pacing back and forth in the waiting area. And we thought, that seems odd for somebody who's about to get on a plane to Toronto, but or we thought Toronto anyway at the time. Anyway, that I guess to a roundabout way of saying no, it wasn't busy, but it was certainly, I think, for that reason, the gentleman was more noticeable than he might otherwise have been.
Now, there was another passenger, Sue Pridham, who thought Mr. Beasley was acting oddly. Sue was 19 years old at the time and worked for the St. John Police Force, which would have given her some degree of situational awareness. Let's go to the clip from Sue.
And I got in the airport, everything seemed to be fine. And there was this man who was sort of wandering around the airport. And he looked suspicious. I don't know, but maybe it was just me and my nerves at that point in time, because I had worked for the police department here, and I sort of double-checked a lot of people. So,
we're speculating a lot here because we're trying to fill in the blank and make a narrative here. But that is type of behavior we usually see when people are not absolutely committed to a cause and have a solid plan. Usually you don't want to be acting nervous or drawing attention to you. And I find that when people are committed to that plan, they are cool, calm, and collected. This was not what we were seeing from Beasley. It's interesting that he was drawing attention, or that's what the eyewitnesses were saying. Let's get on the flight.
Right.
Let's get on this flight. So 6 people board, Mr. Beasley being one of them. It was a short layover, from my understanding, in St. John. It was just a quick pickup of 6 passengers. Then it was going nonstop from St. John to Toronto. Mm-hmm. So Mr. Beasley takes his seat, and we're going to hear from, it's Christine Waud, who was the flight attendant, on her impressions of what she's noticed when Mr. Beasley joined the flight.
I remember it very well, actually.
Yeah.
Like we landed in St. John and picked up some passengers. Yeah, we had, I think we picked up a half a dozen or so passengers.
Yeah.
And I can remember him coming on. He had a garment bag, and I instructed him to put it in the coat rack, the coat room just by the door there. Yeah. He handed me his boarding pass and went in. And then after takeoff, shortly after takeoff, the other flight attendant, Bev, and we were going to do serve drinks, bar, and other beverages. Not too much bar in the morning, but you never know. Yeah. I was working the galley, and she was working the cabin. She gets the orders, brings them back to me, and I felt so. It wasn't too long after takeoff, and he came back, and I was filling the orders, and Bev was standing there, waiting for me to give them to her. And he said, there's going to be a change of plans. He said, we're not going to Toronto. We're going to Cuba. And he did say, I think, that no one would get hurt. Okay. And Bev didn't see, the gun was in my neck, and Bev didn't see that at the time. And she said, she kind of giggled. She says, we haven't got enough fuel to go to Cuba. Well, then he just grabbed her and took her and put the gun to her and marched her up to the cockpit. Yeah. And that's actually the last I saw him. I mean, that door stayed closed the whole time. And Bev came back right away. And we finished. And when she went up, I went through the cabin just to see the reaction of everybody, because I didn't know if they had seen it. People are reading, people are snoozing. Yeah. Yeah. And I think there was a couple of people that asked me, and I told them what it was. And I said, he'll be okay. I said, everything will be okay.
Yeah.
And we finished the drink service. We just carried on, and we were up and down. Nobody said anything.
Yeah.
There was a lady in the front row that was a little upset. She had a baby, and she was upset.
Yeah.
But she was in the very front, facing the bulkhead. Nobody would see her.
Yes.
None of the other passengers would see her.
Yeah.
And then later on, we had the meal service to serve, and we did that. Everybody ate. We cleaned up afterwards. Mm. And the captain came on and said that they would be landing in Montreal, an unscheduled landing in Montreal, and that there would be a gate agent there to direct people to their flight to Toronto. I don't know. These people were really calm. Like, nobody said there was only 17, and which was nice. It wasn't full, and so we carried on. The flight was I can't remember how long it was from St. John. Must be a couple of hours.
Wow, it is so impactful when you hear about an incident like this from someone who actually experienced it. Let's hear the incident from the passenger perspective, starting with Sue Pridham.
They got us on the plane, and everything seemed to be fine. This chap got on the plane, no problem. He had his coat over his arm, and or after we were all seated, I should say, he walked up the aisle as we were just taking off, and we were hardly off the ground, and he had his beige coat around his arm, and I thought that kind of odd. And I looked at Berta Peacock, who was sitting next to me, and I said, "We're being hijacked. We're going to Cuba."
Oh.
And everybody was just getting comfortable when he decided to walk up the aisle and opened the cockpit door and grabbed one of the stewardess and put the sawed-off shotgun, which I figured it was because of my experience at the police department, at the back of her neck. And she very calmly went into the pilot, and the pilot announced that we have basically an unexpected guest aboard, and he would like to go to a destination like Cuba. And it just sort of sparkled from there, and then all of us were sort of very quiet. They fed us while we were on the flight, and at that time most of us were smoking, so of course we lit up our cigarettes because of the nerves, and we continued on. The pilot was very good. The stewardesses were outstanding, especially the one that had the gun in the back of her neck. And the pilot stated that we had to stop in Montreal for fuel because we couldn't make his destination.
And we have a clip from Berta Peacock, now Berta Curran, who was sitting next to Sue.
Well, the fellow walked down the aisle with the gun behind the stewardess, and Susan at that time, I think, was working for the police, and she recognized the kind of gun it was, and we knew that something was going on. And then after he went into the cabin, this woman that had been sitting across was getting very upset because the kid must have been 2 or 3, and he kept moving around, and she was afraid that he would irritate the fellow.
So we don't exactly know how far into the flight they got before the skyjacking occurred. Any thoughts on that? So we did get off the ground. So we have some eyewitnesses saying that it happened almost immediately that the Beasley got out of his seat. Then another account saying, no, it didn't occur until they were into drink service, which if they were into drink service, it would have been at cruising altitude. Thoughts on that? Thoughts on how long it was?
I think it's a latter, and I think that's what Christine's clip says, and also the interviews at the time, that she was working in the galley getting ready, and they wouldn't be doing that during takeoff, and also passengers probably wouldn't be allowed to stand up during takeoff. So it's when things leveled off, cruising speed.
Yeah, but remember, he has a gun. I think he'd be allowed to do anything he wanted to.
But no one knows that at first when someone gets out of their seat, right?
Fair enough. But please take your seat, sir. No. Yeah. You might want to look at the 22 that I'm stashing underneath my jacket. But let's just assume that everything is going normal, that, he wouldn't have got out of his seat until everyone was into that normality of the flight, that people were getting drinks. Because the first person that he makes contact with some sort of demands, threats, was Christine Waud, the flight attendant. And there were two flight attendants. We had Beverley Atkinson. And at the time that he originally took control of this flight, she was in the cabin area taking the drink orders. And Christine Waud was in the back filling those orders. And then Mr. Beasley comes in. And he comes in with a gun. So he got a gun on the Air Canada flight. What type of gun was it?
22 caliber pistol, Mark, but a big one, a revolver. It's a 12 shots. So it's a sizable gun, I think.
Yeah, and I don't know anything about guns, Greg. Mm-hmm. I'll be the first to admit. Maybe some listeners could correct me on this. I just went Googling, and I saw what seemed to be a 22 12 in the chamber revolver, and that's a large gun.
It is, yeah.
So it wasn't a small, easy to conceal thing. This was a rather large gun, and Christine Waud remains calm throughout that. I don't think I would have done half as well as Christine.
Yeah, and Mark, there's no training of Air Canada crew to deal with these types of situations. I just think it was the general training of dealing with the public that really help them and help the passengers and other crew members, because it's quite impressive to look back on it, how they all reacted.
But still, with a large gun and trained at my neck.
Yeah.
I don't think I would have remained calm, but that's me. That's why I'm not in the flight business, I guess, because I don't have the constitution for it. But two, we have to talk about Mr. Beasley. Charles Beasley was an imposing man. He was a large man. He was 6 feet tall and 195 pounds. So he was not a small man carrying a big gun. Big man, big gun. Yeah,
he's a pretty husky guy, and he's tall, and he's young, and he's wearing sunglasses too, which maybe makes it harder for people to see how he's reacting in the terminal and so forth, right? Yeah.
Okay, is it sounding like a movie to you?
Well,
like sunglasses, raincoat, big kind of Wild West gun.
Yeah.
So Beverley Atkinson saying the plane doesn't have enough fuel to get to Cuba. That seemed to set off Charles Beasley and turned the gun from Christine to Beverley and marched her promptly through the cabin to the cockpit.
Yeah, and she was not a tall woman.
Mm-hmm.
I think she was petite, described as petite, right? So he marches her, and so some of the passengers saw what was going on, but a lot of them, unless you're looking at that split section, and he's tall, you don't have a full visual in the cabin, so he takes her up to the cockpit, and they knock on the door, and they go in.
Yep. Did they knock?
Let's just say they knocked.
Let's say they knocked. Being polite.
Yeah.
Going, knock. Who's there? You're a skyjacker. Skyjacker who? No.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have to talk about the cabin walk and who he was going by. So there were 17 people on this flight. Now, as you were saying, some people saw what was going on, so they would have seen the gun. Mm-hmm. Some people were unaware, and I was trying to get in my mind how that would have been possible, having a gunman march someone through a cabin of a relatively small plane. It's a 48-seater, and not seeing it. But I guess, going quick, and Beverley would have been in front of Charles Beasley and probably the gun on her back. Yeah, you might only see the back of a person that large with someone that small in front of them.
And people in the window seat, Mark, the Viscount was known for having great visuals from the windows. They might have been looking at the window. They might have been reading the newspaper. They might have been looking down at their shoes. I mean, I don't spend my time in a flight looking down the aisle, right? So who knows, right? I mean, it's different possibilities.
Yeah, but let's bring some of the terror element to this. And there were people who saw this, and one was a young mother with an 8-month-old baby?
10-month,
10-month-old baby?
Yes. And And she was quite, from eyewitness accounts and also interviews, that she was quite worried personally as a mother, but also she was worried that she seemed to know what was going on, that something bad was happening, and that she was worried that her 10-month-old son, Phillipe, I think it was, maybe might fuss and cry and upset the gunman. Right.
Yeah, so I can imagine that adding to her terror. One thing, seeing that there's a gunman on the plane, but having a small child that, have you ever flown with a small child?
No, but
as a parent?
But I've flown with, in cabins of small children. I've always sympathized with parents who have young children.
Yeah, I've been that parent, trying to keep my 10-month-old quiet during a trip, so not to disturb normal passengers and being worried about getting people upset. I can't imagine trying to keep a 10-month-old quiet when there's a gunman and I'm thinking that this might set the person off.
There was also the boxer, right?
Yes.
The young boxer, He claimed later that he saw something, and also I think his father, that was Rene Durelle, who was...
Rene Durelle, light heavyweight boxer. Was he light heavyweight boxing champion in Canada?
He was going back to defend his title for a fight in Toronto, and he was with his father, Placide, and Placide was the brother of the famous Yvon Durelle, the fighting fisherman, famous boxer out of New Brunswick, and Mr. Fred Smith, who was a Miramichi area businessman and promoter, was on board as well. And so I think both the father and the son saw the gun. And what was Rene's reaction? Well, he later told a reporter that he was tempted to take a swing at the guy, but he was worried about the gun, about danger, about being in the plane, that type of thing. Placide noticed that the gun was cocked, I think, which meant that, my understanding, Mark, is that, there's no real safety on a revolver. When you cock the gun, when you pull the hammer back, that's kind of like removing the sort of safety sort of thing. The next step is squeezing that trigger.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, that could have gone wrong for Charles Beasley, too. He happened to just get on a flight that has the light heavyweight boxing champion of Canada on it.
I know.
But, certainly Rene did the right thing, because especially if it was cocked, that's a danger, right? If a gun goes off inside a pressurized cabin at that altitude, that's creating a danger for everyone. So made the right choice. So that's what's going on in the cabin. Then other people blissfully unaware, and even one person being blissfully unaware until they reached Montreal and exited the plane. Let's go to Mike Wenberg.
It's... ignorance is bliss. And in my case, I guess I was in heaven because throughout the flight, I didn't have a clue what was going on. I did notice very quizzical, and I guess in some couple of passengers' cases, nervous looking glances towards me. And I sort of looked back at them politely, but that was it. And I certainly noticed the cockpit door opening and slamming shut quite a few times, which I thought was peculiar, but really didn't notice anything beyond that on the flight. It was, as I say, ignorance was bliss, and it was only when we heard the pilot saying that we would in fact be diverting to Montreal instead of to Toronto that I thought, well, that's peculiar. But again, I didn't realize why. I assumed there was some technical reason.
But for the other people who were aware of that must have been a terrifying flight, because this is a propeller plane. Mm-hmm. It's not a jet plane. This would have been, an hour and a half at least, maybe a 2-hour flight.
And they had read about and heard about hijacking, so there hadn't been too many fatalities yet, but, anything could happen. And it must have been the longest flight of their lives.
Okay, let's get into that cockpit. So... Beasley marches Beverley, Atkinson to the cockpit, enters the cockpit. Two of them join the pilot and co-pilot. So the pilot's name is Captain Ronald Hollett of Toronto, and the first officer was Robert Bromley of Ottawa. So 4 in the cockpit, and then Beverley is released quickly.
Yeah, she convinces, according to newspaper accounts, Mr. Garvey, they still know him as Mr. Garvey, to let her go back. She's no longer needed to look after the passengers. And, to her credit, she comes back more than once to check on things and to bring them coffee and maybe some food. So if you just think about that as a stewardess, carrying on, right? And of course, a lot of the passengers seem to know, but they don't want to make eye contact or say too much in case it triggers anything off. So they just want to get through it, right? So it must have been a very tense situation for both the flight attendants and those passengers.
Absolutely. And Beasley is in the cockpit with the pilot and co-pilot. We don't know exactly what happened, but they were obviously, the pilot, co-pilot, and air traffic control, and probably the Air Canada brass, they were taking this seriously. What did they actually do as a contingency plan in case they were actually flying to Cuba?
Well, once they made radio contact and told them they were diverting, Air Canada filed a flight plan for the plane to refuel at Dorval, west of Montreal, because that's where the captain did convince Mr. Beasley that they needed to go there to refuel. They weren't going to make it. So I think that was the right move. Get that plane on the ground. So they filed a flight plan to, was it North Carolina, Mark? To go to North Carolina?
North Carolina, because you couldn't make it from Montreal all the way to Cuba on a Viscount. Yeah, you had to do at least one stop. Yeah,
the Viscount was a regional carrier type plane. And then they would refuel at North Carolina and make the flight into Havana if need be. So they were taking it pretty seriously.
They were. Now, let's talk about that diverting to Montreal, because that's interesting. That was a great move on the part of the captain. We're assuming that the captain convinced Beasley that they needed to go to Montreal. Now, Montreal, that would have been the closest place to get on the ground quick.
Major airport,
airport. And I think that would be a strategic move on the part of the pilot, is that they would want to be hitting a major airport that would have the resources to deal with this type of crisis. So good move on him. Interesting, though, why Beasley decided to let that happen. Toronto would have actually been closer to Cuba and been less of a flight. They were going there anyway. Why he was convinced to go to Montreal, but maybe they gave him a story going, you know what, this is the best place or most direct flight or something.
Yeah, and Montreal, wasn't that, but as a crow flies, wasn't that much closer. It's close. Also, Montreal was the headquarters of Air Canada. Maybe they felt it would be better to be close to the head office. I don't know, but yeah. And then and then they also started this narrative. This is just based on newspaper accounts that, do you really want to go to Cuba? Cuba might not be the place you want to go to. Like, Canada would be better for you to stay in Canada. Why don't you see if you can stay in Canada? So that was a very bold stroke, and I think a really interesting approach. That pilot, and maybe the co-pilot as well, was part of the discussion, right? That was a pretty clever thing.
That was ingenious, and obviously they had some time and the wherewithal to get a rapport going with Mr. Beasley during that time of that hour and a half to convince him of going, do you want to rethink this? You're in control here. You say we're going to Cuba, we're going to Cuba. But, there are some options that you might want to consider. Okay, Greg, let's get this bird on the ground.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're in the air still, and these negotiations are happening. What, if anything, does the flight crew say to the passengers?
Well, the only announcement, and I don't know what the flight attendant said. The only announcement was, we have a special person on board.
Here's the quote coming from the newspaper articles. We need to go to Montreal as we have a special passenger to take somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of go, you might not be done in Montreal.
Yeah.
So that was the announcement that went out, and then it was time to go to Montreal. Now, we're not going to Montreal. We're going to Dorval, which is just on the outskirts.
We say Montreal Airport, but that was in Dorval, separate municipality. So they had their own police force, which was which responded to the incident, and also Mounties were there and the Air Canada officials.
Let's bring the bird down. So the bird's coming in, the plane's coming in for a landing onto the tarmac at Dorval International Airport, which I can imagine how that would have been for everyone that was in the know of getting to the ground, because like there would have to be that relief when you felt those wheels hit the tarmac and you come to a stop. Let's hear about the landing at Durelle from Christine.
And when we landed, we had to park out a ways. There wasn't a gate for us, and we just were sitting there. And I don't know if the hijacker thought that we were pulling a fasty or something, because he kept opening up the cockpit door and looking out, and then he would close it and look out. I guess it was to see if maybe any RCMP were coming on or something. And then I guess the captain got the word to shut the engines down. So he just shut the engines down. We were quite a ways out. And he just shut the engines down, and he came back and apologized to the people that they had such a long walk in the rain. That's what he said. And he opened the door, and then we all went across to the and there was people meeting us. Yep. And there was some gate agents that took the passengers wherever they take them, somewhere, and got their flights organized. I never saw any of that anymore. So, yeah.
I sensed that relief from Christine, but not everyone had a good feeling about being on the ground. Let's go again to Sue Pridham to hear her recollection of the landing.
Then when we got to Montreal, the scary part was I figured he's not going to do anything while we're in the air, because he's only going to compromise himself too. So once we landed in Montreal, everybody got a little edgy because we knew something could happen then, especially with a live gun in the plane. Yes, we had the police department, we had the fire department, we had rescue vehicles out there, and with their guns drawn, we had the OPP and QP, or not the OPP, but Quebec Provincial Police and the RCMP, I should say.
Wow. And do you remember if the plane stayed away from the terminal?
Yes, it did.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we were on the plane for quite some time while they negotiated with the hijacker. And finally, after some time, he let us off, and they took us all into a room. And they interviewed some of us, and some of us they didn't. I did, because I was one of the ones interviewed. It wasn't a long interview or anything, just basically saying, what did you see?
Right.
And coming from working in the identification department, the police department, I knew what I was looking at.
Right. So that must have been like the local police, maybe, Durelle Police or Sûreté de Quebec?
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's hear one more perspective of the landing, and that is Mike Wenberg.
And so the first I realized that we had been hijacked was when we got off the plane and were ushered by Air Canada employees to the Air Canada lounge, or whatever it then was, and offered drinks, which being at that point 18, or I guess I was 18, was happy to receive, although it was only then I was told what had happened, and realized that I was fast asleep at the wheel.
Let's talk about where they positioned the plane. Did the pilot bring them into the terminal building and to unload the passengers, or did they stay on the tarmac?
They not only did they stay on the tarmac, the reports and maybe one of our interviews suggest that it was a little beyond the usual range. And that could have been for two reasons: that both the authorities at the airport wanted, in case something did happen, like a gunfight or something, they didn't want it close to the terminal fuel tanks, but also it might be that Mr. Beasley was still a bit skittish. Like he only wanted one person to come out to refuel. He didn't want any of the baggage to be, because he was worried about undercover police, I think maybe posing as baggage handlers, So he still remained vigilant. And of course, accounts suggest that he was, opening the door and looking out and things like that, the cabin door, not the cockpit door. So it's a variety of reasons that might feed into that, but they stayed away.
Yeah, I tried to look that up, try to see, because it made sense to me to stay away from the terminal building when you could have potential gunshots going off. You wouldn't want stray bullets going anywhere close to a larger population. I was going to Google that, Greg, but then I decided, you know what? I've been Googling way too much on skyjacking, and I don't want to be on someone's list any more than I might be on someone's list. I'm not going to be Googling the protocol at an airport.
Are you saying that
skyjacking?
Are you expecting CSIS to knock on your door on Monday?
It might happen. It might happen with the amount of research I've been doing on this. But yeah, so they're out on the tarmac. Now, there are two different accounts. One was that the passengers and the flight attendants were let go almost immediately. The other was there was some negotiation back and forth. And I think probably there would have been some negotiation on the part of Beasley, or at least talking to the RCMP and other officials. Now, who was the first person that Beasley made contact with when on the ground?
So what happened? He put a request in. I want to talk to a Cuban embassy, whatever. So there was a consular, not an embassy, but a consular office in Montreal, because it's an important trade center. And so the RCMP or Air Canada made a call, but when the Cuban official found out that the alleged hijacker was not a Cuban citizen, he refused to come to the airport. So that might have factored into Beasley's decision to see, okay, maybe I better go with this asylum plan
so
here.
The pilots planted the seed in the air.
Yeah.
You might not want to go to Cuba. You might want to try asylum in Canada. And then as soon as he got shut down by the Cuban consulate, that probably goes, okay, maybe Cuba isn't the best idea.
But Mark, I think his reaction also shows what, despite the reception, a lot of the reporting in newspaper cartoons that Fidel Castro was somehow engineering all of these hijackings. And by the way, most flights that were hijacked to Cuba were not hijacked by Cubans, they're hijacked by Americans. But in reality, the Cuban government was getting fed up with many of these hijackings, right? So here's an example. Here's an example. The first attempt to go from Canada to Cuba, we don't want you.
We don't want the headaches of this. So he got denied, and then he started negotiating, I believe, with the RCMP, who then reached out to, was it the Minister of Foreign Affairs, or was it Minister of Justice?
Because the issue the issue of asylum means we're not going to prosecute you under the criminal. No, again, you would think it would be an immigration and citizenship minister, but we're not going to prosecute you. We're going to. I think the wording was to the degree that the laws of Canada allow.
Now, who was the Minister of Justice at that time?
John Turner, who had taken over from Pierre Trudeau when Trudeau became Prime Minister earlier in the year.
So John Turner would go on to become Prime Minister of Canada. Was involved.
Yes.
On the periphery of the first skyjacking in Canadian history. Fun fact.
Yeah.
Okay, so they start to have those conversations. Now, there are two different accounts about how they were received on the tarmac, and it seems like there were a lot of emergency vehicles that did attend to the plane, and I think that makes sense. There was the account that guns were drawn.
Well,
thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think police were ready, but I think they were at a distance. I don't think there were any emergency vehicles out the plane.
Okay,
they were at a distance,
so they kept their distance, but they were ready to respond.
There's some accounts that the Durelle police got their long guns and things like that. But again, I mean, there's no photos that we've seen of the incident, right? When it started on the tarmac. But I think people stayed. They held back, but maybe as a contingency, they were ready to go with ambulances and things just in case. And there would have been firefighters at the airport, and RCMP are also called.
You know why I want to believe that? Because still people on that flight had no idea they were being skyjacked. And I think if there were a bunch of police with guns trained on the plane, they would have gone, I think something's happening here. So I think it does go to the account that the authorities did hold back, that they weren't moving in and surrounding the plane.
It's also a de-escalation tactic. And also, Mark, there were no SWAT teams or emergency response teams anywhere in Canada in 1968. I know that from my work on policing history. There was no rule book. I mean, if you had something like a bank robbery or a barricaded situation. Sometimes, like you saw plainclothes detectives would go home and get their hunting rifles and show up. It was not. There was no response ready for this type of thing.
So you were making it up on the fly, and I'm not doing a pun with the skyjacking with the fly. But okay, so we have the release of the passengers, the 17 passengers and the 2 flight crew.
Which is something. I mean, you have to give, whether you agree or disagree with Beasley, the idea of pointing a loaded revolver at stewardesses and a child on, all the things that could go wrong, and why he sought to punish Canada in a way for what America was doing or whatever. But to his credit, he did let everyone go except the 2 pilots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so everyone left, and we'll talk about the leaving and the passengers, what happened to them after they exited the plane. But they would have exited through the back, because the Viscount was a rear-loading plane. So they would have been well away from the cockpit, where the pilot and the co-pilot were still being held hostage. Now, there was some negotiation, and then finally Beasley agrees with the promises or assurances that political asylum would be pursued. He didn't have an inked deal that he was being granted political asylum, but then he agreed to surrender the gun to the flight crew.
Yeah.
So we don't know exactly how that went down. It would have been interesting to be a fly on the wall on how that kind of surrender was done, but the gun would have been handed over to the pilot or the co-pilot. I don't know how that would have been communicated to the people outside, so that they knew that the person was actually, in reality, unarmed, because they entered the plane afterwards. Who was it that entered the plane again?
It was a pretty senior officer. Normally assistant commissioner of the RCMP would not be walking into a crime scene and taking custody of a guy who was reported as having a loaded handgun. But this was high priority, high profile. And so Assistant Commissioner Carrier, I think it was, I forget his name now, it's in the media, and reports. And then I think maybe an NCO, a sergeant, went with them. And no bulletproof vests. I don't think they were carrying weapons, and he didn't have handcuffs. The thing is, too, Mark, I've read a report in the media that Captain Hollett, when the gun was passed over, he remarked, like, well, of course it wasn't loaded, was it? And then he was shocked to find out that the gun was fully loaded.
Yeah, and that speaks a lot to what was happening, or at least in my mind, it speaks a lot to the intent. You could have got everything that Beasley got with an unloaded gun.
Sure.
Unless you had as a contingency in your mind that it might turn violent.
Yeah.
He brought a loaded gun onto a civilian aircraft.
Well, again, already had been accused of bank robbery with a pistol, and we don't know how much people gave thought to those sorts of things when they're committing these crimes, right? I mean, maybe they weren't even thinking about it, but yeah.
But, okay, so for some reason the officials were convinced that he was disarmed. Did he come out right away, or did he ask for just a few minutes to finish up something?
One account is that he didn't leave the plane until he finished a meal. Yeah. So I don't know where that meal, if it was already a meal that was on the plane. There's no accounts of them being brought a meal, but I thought that was an interesting little human interest story, side to it, right? Yeah. Or maybe he hadn't, he left Halifax about 1 or 2 in the morning, right? And maybe he hadn't had any food.
Well, skyjacking, it works up an appetite.
Well, Mark, I'll take your word on that.
Yeah, well, again, I'm not a skyjacker. Okay. But yeah, so he exited the plane and then was taken into custody. Now, let's go back to the passengers. Remember, they were released before. Yeah. They were brought into Dorval International Airport, I believe, into the VIP lounge or something like that.
I think something like that. And also, remember, Mark, they had to walk a longer distance in the rain, I think.
Yeah.
And they got in. And then some of them were told, oh, by the way, right, the real reason you're here is because the plane was hijacked.
And they go, what with the witch now?
Yeah. Others already knew.
Yeah.
And then so Air Canada, I don't know how much debriefing there was, but they were sent on a plane within an hour or two to Toronto. But it took a while for the baggage catch up. Because baggage was still on the plane, right? And so, so they gave them, I think, according to some accounts, they gave them a small amount of money. Well, of course, $25 back in 1968 would be, a bit more sizable. Seems like a small amount,
Still,
to
I
buy
just got skyjacked
in case they need to buy change of clothes or toiletries when they got to Toronto. And then there's differences of opinion from our interviews in terms of what else they got. One of our interviewees said that they may have been given something else and for their trouble. But again, what's amazing to me is that how little follow-up and debriefing and things like that there was of the crew and Air Canada in general after this happening, right?
Yeah. Now, there were some interviews by the officials, though, like they were debriefed, and but not for long. And then they were let go and they could travel on their merry way.
Yeah. And both flight attendants interviewed at the time said this was not going to deter them from pursuing their career, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the media went hounding pretty quickly, especially on the flight crew and the two flight attendants
interviewed
and the passengers.
Pictures were in the national news, interviews of different people. So there were, those stories appeared all over Canada, and some of those stories for a day or two were picked up in media right across the United States as well. So
remember the account of Christine Waud. And she was like, "Oh, I'm getting hounded so much. I need some space." And she went to a cabin, I believe, with her husband to try to get away from the media pressure, and then returned to her apartment, I guess, and found a gift there from Air Canada. And what did Air Canada give her for her troubles?
We assume that Bev maybe got the same gift, and it's kind of, in a way, kind of gendered, but they were sent roses. But by the time Christine got back with her husband, that roses had wilted and died.
Yeah. Would that be a nice thing to come back to, is dead flowers on your doorstep after this?
You wonder what the pilot's got anything, right?
We don't know.
I hope they all got commendations in their file, because I think they all did an amazing job.
Yes. So just to wrap up the actual skyjacking, so a range of responses from the passengers, at least. Let's hear from Sue on how the incident impacted her.
It's like, for me, it was, oh my soul, what's going on here? Like, I'm 19 years old, and I don't want to go to Cuba. I don't want to die either. And I think that probably was the same with a lot of people, so everybody was very quiet. Hush, hush.
Everyone processes an incident like this differently. There is no right or wrong response. You feel what you feel. I know I would have been traumatized. But let's hear from Berta on her reaction to the skyjacking.
At least I wasn't terribly upset, because at that time nobody was getting hurt from those occasions. They kind of just took the person where they wanted to go, and everybody went home. People were behind me. I guess everybody was probably quiet, so nothing would get worse. No, I was thinking that we would be getting a free trip to Cuba.
I love that line from Berta. She was like, "Aw, Cuba is so much warmer this time of year." Spoken like a Canadian who has suffered through too many freezing cold Septembers. But now let's hear from Christine to get her take. And remember, she had a loaded and likely cocked gun held to her.
I was concerned. You don't know. You wonder why he's doing it. That's the main thing. Does he want to take the whole plane down, or does he want to go to Cuba? And why? That was mainly it. But having the passengers so calm, I think, helped a great deal. If we would have had some people panicking, it might have been, I think, different for us, And
then some legitimate trauma from this experience, and that sense of the loss of security that came along with this incident. The next time they flew, they were watching their back. They were quite nervous, and especially until more stringent security came in.
Yeah, and the other thing too, I was impressed by the people I talked to with the interviews, is how they didn't seem to have a lot of personal animus against Beasley, given that what he had done. I mean, it didn't come out in the interviews anyway.
Short-term Stockholm?
I don't know, but just, maybe I don't know, they're empathetic or whatever, but you think about, someone has pulled a gun on airline stewardesses and there could be a lot of negativity towards him, but I didn't get that. through the interviews.
Okay, let's go back to Charles Beasley. He's just been hauled off in custody from the airplane he skyjacked. What happened to him?
Well, he's interviewed by the Durelle police, and I'm not sure the Mounted police interviewed him because, the Durelle, the airport was in the jurisdiction of local police, so they investigate the crime, right? The political asylum thing seems to go by the wayside, and he's taken down to be held in custody in the infamous Bordeaux jail in Montreal, which is actually at the time, I think there were a number of FLQ prisoners being housed there as well. And he eventually will face charges. There is no law against hijacking, so the Crown hits him with the kitchen sink and everything else, right?
Yeah. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
There was no law actually against hijacking an airplane, so they had to go, okay, well, I guess we have a little bit of kidnapping in here. We could get a couple of assaults. I think they even threw a theft over. Theft over $1,000 for stealing an airplane?
Yeah, you dirty rat, you tried to steal our plane. Right? And no, Mark, you may know this. The assault, would that be like pointing a weapon or just like manhandling someone? I mean,
any physical touch, right, is an assault, right? Yeah. So like grabbing the stewardess, pushing a gun, any sort of physical contact would constitute assault. Yeah. So that would have done it.
Yeah. So he pleaded not guilty at first. He got a lawyer. There's a bit of legal history there. And then the Crown, I don't know if they offered him a deal, but the Crown dropped the charges to 4. And then he pleaded guilty. So it didn't go to trial, which is bad for us because that means there's no trial record that we could look into. And in December of 1968, and again, the wheels of justice back then, Mark, turned a little bit more swiftly, didn't they?
Wow, did they ever?
Yeah.
Because he wrapped this up and was sentenced. Like this happened in September. He was sentenced by December.
And there was a preliminary inquiry, and Christine went down. I don't know if she testified, but a number of Air Canada people, I don't think any passengers were there, but a number of people went to the preliminary inquiry. Right?
This is incredible. Incredible when I'm thinking about how long things take nowadays. Was it a quicker process? Or did they have more resources? Or did they have less lawyers making all these objections to everything?
Based on my study of murder trials did get lengthier. I mean, the turnaround process did become lengthier over time. For one thing, this is pre-charter, right? So yeah, and of course, so sentenced to 6 years. The judge was not happy. Of course, judges have to denounce crimes as well, right? And deterrence and things like that. So it was kidnapping, public mischief, and 2 counts of assault.
Okay, so he did his time in Canada, which he later in that 2001 interview he gave, he was saying good things about the Canadian justice system. I guess, though, he was comparing it to the Texas justice system.
So when he gave that interview in 2011, I think he thought that the Canadian police and court system had treated him with a certain amount of respect. I'm sure at the time he hadn't been totally thrilled. Of course, he did his time in, we'd like to know about, where he was in terms of penitentiary. He served, we don't know if he served a full 6 years.
Yeah, I read he was released after 3 years.
Okay, 3 years. Okay, good.
And then deported. So 2 things could have happened. It could have been extradition to the United States on that U.S. warrant, or it could have been deportation. There are 2 different processes.
Yeah.
But both of them would have ended in the same result, and that is a greeting at the U.S. border by FBI to take him into custody. Yeah. So he went from custody to Canada, didn't enjoy a moment of freedom before he was back in custody, and sent to Texas to serve his time for the original bank robbery that happened in August of 1968.
Yeah.
And how much time did he get for that?
He was sentenced to 10 years, and I'm trying to remember if, the American justice system was a bit more liberal then than it is now, right? So there were things like parole and probation, things like that. So I'm not sure if he served the full 10 years, but he was sentenced to 10 years for that original bank robbery in Ladonia, Texas.
And then when he was released, and this is according to Charles Beasley in that 2001 interview, he ended up moving to New Haven, Connecticut, where he started to interact with the radical university student population that was forming there. and who were troubled by American global imperialism. Thoughts on that? On the validity of... I
like to fact check that. Of course, a lot of it might be hard to do. I personally, I find it a little far-fetched, but it's plausible. I mean, a guy who has gotten out of prison, who's from Texas, who hasn't lived in the North really, ends up at Yale University. I mean, but if it's true, it certainly shows his continued interest in activism, right? And of course, that was like during the Reagan era with Central America and all that sort of stuff going on, right? And quite controversial American foreign policy. So, and then he, in the mid-'80s, he does return to Texas, right, Mark?
He does. Should mention one thing that he said in that 2001 interview is, and this just seems, it's almost too perfect, is he said that with the students, he became kind of their mentor. He brought them to New York City to see the Twin Towers and pointed them out as an example of the decadence of the United States imperialism. So it's almost like this is just shaping up like a too perfect of a story, but that was his account. And then he robbed another bank.
Yeah, he robbed another bank in Texas, and I'm not sure there was a political angle to this. I'm trying to remember now.
Yeah, but it wound him back up in prison, and that's where he was interviewed in 2001. He was actually serving time for that second bank robbery. Yeah. And that's when he did say his motivation for the 1968 skyjacking, and it was that he called it the first in the history of commercial airlines that focused on U.S. oppression as being the motivation, the political motivation. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I don't think it was the first one focused on U.S. oppression, but he said it was an act designed to show America that their skies were weak.
Well, that was certainly true. Up to about 72, 73, when security measures came in. And even after that, there's acts of terrorism abroad targeting American airliners, right, into the 70s, into the 80s. But the problem I have with that is that this was Air Canada. Right? This is not an American plane. Canada didn't have that same reputation as America globally. In fact, we had a much more benign reputation. Maybe that was totally earned or true. And also, this was owned by, it was Canadian passengers. There were no Americans on board. So what it had to do with the United States? I think he wanted to get to Cuba. And
let's give him the benefit of the doubt and really stretch things. He was going to go through U.S. airspace and land in North Carolina. So hey, maybe it's showing your weakness that you can be really infiltrated through Canada. Let's just give him benefit.
Okay, let's do that. Yeah, and again, but like the trouble is we tend to embellish and change our life narratives after the fact, right? So I think part of his story was changing as he went. But again, we don't know unless we could interview him, and we don't even know where he is now, right, Mark? We would love to hear from him or about him.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. We tried to track him down.
Yeah.
We did the usual searches, but can't find out if he's still around. If he's because how old would he likely be now?
Well, if he was born in like 46 or so, right? He would be, he'd be what, 80?
79, 80?
80s, yeah.
So plausible. He's around. Maybe he's listening to this podcast. Wow. Okay, so let's finish it off with, did the 1968 skyjacking in Canada, did it change anything? Was there a response to this by Air Canada, by the political arm of the Canadian government? Did anything change?
Could we say crickets chirping here, Mark? Nada.
I want to insert that sound.
Yeah. Okay.
I might
pause.
do that in editing.
But no, Mark, there's no immediate response. I'm just amazed that there was no, according to Bud Kavanaugh and Christine Waud, that there was no follow-up or memos or any training. There was scuttlebutt. They talked about it at the airport, and no doubt the flight attendants and their families and friends. But there was no follow-up. I mean, it was only as things got more serious and things got more serious in the United States that the Canadian government got more on the ball, and the airlines as well, right? And Air Canada being the major carrier and government owned, I think it had to lead by example here, right?
Yeah, they did. And maybe in their minds, they thought this was one and done. but it wasn't, was it?
No.
Quickly, we're not going into any detail with this, but tell me about the 1971, December 26th on Boxing Day, the first successful skyjacking, depending on what you call success, in Canada.
And that had parallels to our story because it's Patrick Clinton, who's a black activist who's been involved in a bank robbery in New York City where I think there was a shootout, and maybe one of the black activists in that shootout was killed by the police. He's on the run. So he ends up coming to Canada. He crosses the border. Similarities here with our guy, and he picks up an Air Canada flight to Toronto from Thunder Bay. I mean, there's a lot of similarities between Thunder Bay and St. John, small regional airport, right? But he has a grenade and a gun, and he hijacks the plane. He successfully hijacks the plane. I think it's a jet, which gives him a bit more flexibility, right? Because they have a longer range, and he is flown to Havana, and of course the crew, the plane comes back, right? And he remains. They had his name, but he remains on the run. He spends some time in Cuba. He ends up
under custody. He was arrested
at first,
in Cuba.
A lot of them did face this in Cuba. It wasn't a paradise for them. And then he ends up going to Africa. He becomes a professor. I think he marries, and then he returns to the United States, but he's not arrested. Right?
No, he's not.
It's because this crime took place in Canada, but still we share information. And many, many years later, a cold case detective tracks him down, and he is arrested. Mark, when?
So he's arrested, and this is there's too many coincidences on dates with these Canadian hijackings. He is arrested by American officials. Get this, Greg, in New York City, on September the 8th, 2001.
Yeah.
3 days before 9/11. Come on.
And that's on the bank robbery charge, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the American charges,
And extradited to Canada
later,
soon after, to face the skyjacking, the 31-year stale skyjacking charge, because no, it wouldn't have been skyjacking either, because 1971, before skyjacking came.
It would have been the law at the time. Right.
He did how much time on that? 5 years. I'm seeing 2 years pre-sentence custody and 3 years concurrent sentences for kidnapping and extortion was the charges.
You will find several other podcasts who deal with the story.
And then we had that Canadian DB Cooper. We won't go into any detail with that, but that predates DB Cooper with the same MO, except he was unsuccessful. Didn't get the parachute out of the plane because the flight crew overtook him.
Yeah, no, they hit him with an axe.
Yep.
Yeah, but he had a ransom demand. He tried to parachute out of a plane over Alberta?
I believe so.
And then that name was Paul Tinney, and CINI, and again, just sometime after that, the person known as DB Cooper carried out the same thing and was never seen again. Right.
So there was skyjacking in Canada, and it all started in a small airport in St. John, New Brunswick. But in the early 70s, we finally started getting those new security procedures, luggage and passenger screening, metal detectors, and RCMP officers actually stationed at many airports. Before there were commissionaires, but they would have been unarmed and not really into this kind of level of criminal intervention. So we didn't really get that seriousness. And then in 1972, we finally had it, Greg. The criminal code was amended. And I'm looking at the current provisions of the criminal code. They were different numbers, but the same essence. And we have section 76 now with the criminal code. That's hijacking. That's hijacking of a plane or a vessel, a ship.
Yeah.
And you're looking at now life in prison.
Up to life.
As a maximum.
Yeah, up to life,
And then you have section 77 that came in at the same time, 72, but not section 77, endangering safety of an aircraft or airport. So they broadened it out and saw, the airports are vulnerable too. And we have to have a very a specific criminal offense or prohibition against this, and another extremely high maximum being life in prison.
Yeah.
And then finally, we have section 78 of the current criminal code, offensive weapons and explosive substances. You bring a gun on an airplane, Greg. You bring explosives, whether you intend to use it or not. What are you looking at?
Up to 14 years.
Yeah, so serious offenses. So it's really, when you see criminal code provisions in there and those maximums, that's the communication of how this society thinks about the crime.
And there were a couple of people convicted under that new law soon after in Canada. One fellow had a gun either in an airport or on a plane that was in Quebec. And then there was a guy who used a knife, a steak knife that was on board the flight, and held it to the throat of a stewardess. And both of those gentlemen were convicted under that new law. And thankfully, there were very few incidents after that in Canada.
Yeah, it did curtail the golden age of skyjacking. And the final thing was the 1973 Aeronautics Act that required airlines to develop and fund security plans.
Yeah, and also Canada's diplomatic agreement with Cuba that they would agree to extradite offenders, but they would reserve the right to withhold political asylum seekers, right? So
yes,
yeah.
So I'd say, Greg, the golden age of skyjacking ended in 1973, but it began in 1968 in a small airport in St. John, New Brunswick. And that is the podcast. And Greg, this is becoming harder to say every time, but proof. Once again, St. John, nothing happened here.
Thank you for listening to St. John, Nothing Happened Here. To learn more, join us at www.nothinghappenedhere.ca or connect with us on Facebook. Other means of communication include, but are not limited to, telegrams, smoke signals, and carrier pigeons. However you want to reach us, we want to hear from you.